The morning sun hit the marble floors of the foyer, but the light felt cold. I stood at the kitchen island, clutching a ceramic mug that had been in my family for 40 years. Across from me she sat scrolling through her phone. To anyone else, she looked like a devoted daughter-in-law, but I saw the way her eyes darted toward the antique silver chest in the corner. It wasn't a look of admiration, it was a look of inventory. For months, the atmosphere in this house had shifted from warmth to a calculated silence. It started with small comments about my forgetfulness. A set of keys misplaced here, a stove left on there. I knew I hadn't left that burner running, but the concerned tilt of her head made me doubt my own shadow. She was weaving a web, thread by invisible thread, trying to turn my own home into a cage. I sipped my coffee, watching her over the rim. She thought I was a relic of a passing era, a stubborn obstacle standing between her and a massive inheritance. She didn't realize that I had built this empire from nothing. I knew exactly how to spot a predator, even one wearing a designer sundress. The following Tuesday, I noticed the first blatant lie. Sienna, 28 and sharp-featured, walked into the living room while Julian was fixing a drink. She stopped dead, staring at the coffee table. "Gloria, dear," she said, her voice dripping with artificial honey. "Did you leave the patio door unlocked again? I just saw it swinging wide." I looked at her, my pulse quickening. I hadn't been near the patio since Sunday. Julian looked over, his brow furrowed with a worry that Sienna had spent weeks planting. "Mom, you have to be careful. Someone could just walk in." "I didn't open it, Julian," I said firmly. My name, Gloria Vance, felt like a shield I was trying to hold up against a rising tide. Sienna sighed, a theatrical sound of exhausted patience. "It's okay. We'll just add it to the list for the doctor on Thursday. It's just the third time this week, Julian." She walked over and squeezed my hand. Her skin was cold. In that moment I realized the house wasn't being haunted by my fading memory. It was being haunted by a woman who wanted my keys, my name, and my peace. I smiled back at her, but behind my eyes I was already counting my moves. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and quiet judgment. Sienna sat in the corner of the exam room, a notebook open on her lap as if she were a dedicated researcher. Dr. Aris was a man I had known for 10 years, but as he looked at me, I saw the shift. Sienna had been calling him. She had been sending documented incidents of my supposed decline. "Gloria," he began softly, "Julian and Sienna have expressed some concerns about your orientation to time and place." I sat tall, my spine pressing against the hard plastic chair. "I am perfectly oriented, doctor. I can tell you the current market value of my holdings, the date of my late husband's passing, and exactly which burner Sienna turned on last night to make it look like I was negligent." The room went silent. Sienna's face didn't crumble. She simply looked at the doctor with a pained, pitying expression. "See," she whispered, "the paranoia is getting worse. She thinks I'm plotting against her." Dr. Aris scribbled something. I realized then that my intelligence was being used as evidence of my mania. They weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for a reason to sign the papers. The trap was closing. I didn't argue when we left the clinic. In the car, I looked out the window at the sprawling trees of my estate. If they wanted to play the game of invisible Gloria, I would play. That night, while the house slept, I sat in my darkened study. I didn't turn on the lights. I used the glow of a private tablet, one Sienna didn't know I owned. I called Marcus, my oldest friend and a ruthless offshore broker. We spoke in low tones. "I need to move, Marcus. All of it. The Vance holdings, the commercial blocks, the art." "Gloria, that's a massive undertaking," he whispered. "If the court freezes your assets because of this petition, I can't help you." "Then we do it before the petition is served," I replied. "I want the house listed on a private high-speed tier. Cash buyers only. No walkthroughs until the final week. I want the liquid assets moved into the trust we discussed in Zurich." I looked at a photo of Julian on my desk. My heart ached, but I knew he was lost to Sienna's whispers. He wouldn't save me. He would only hold the door while she ushered me into a nursing home. I hit send on the first batch of authorizations. The fire sale had begun. 3 days later, the caregiver arrived. Sienna had hired her without asking me. A tall, stern woman named Martha who followed me from room to room, taking notes on a clipboard. I was a prisoner in a house I paid for, surrounded by furniture I no longer technically owned. Marcus had been fast. The deeds were already transitioning to a holding company. Sienna was emboldened now. She stopped hiding her contempt. "You should move into the garden suite, Gloria," she said over lunch, poking at her salad. "The stairs in the main wing are getting dangerous for you. We'll move our things into the master suite this weekend." I wiped my mouth with a silk napkin. "The master suite is mine, Sienna. It was built for me." "It was," she corrected, leaning in. Her voice was a low hiss. "But Julian is the heir. And since you can't manage the estate anymore, the court is going to make him the conservator. We're just getting a head start. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I felt a surge of cold fury, but I kept my face as still as stone. "I see," I said quietly. "You've thought of everything." She smiled, thinking she had finally broken me. The house felt lighter, though Sienna didn't notice. I had spent the week systematically removing small, high-value items, jewelry, rare coins, and my late husband's journals, and courier mailing them to a secure vault in London. To Sienna, the house looked the same. She was too busy picking out new wallpaper for her bedroom to notice the empty spaces in the safe. The legal petition arrived on a Thursday afternoon. A man in a suit walked up the driveway and handed me the papers. "Gloria Vance? You've been served." Sienna was standing in the foyer, watching with a look of pure triumph. Julian was behind her, looking at the floor. He couldn't even meet my eyes. "It's for your own good, Mom," Julian muttered, his voice shaking. "Of course it is," I said, looking at the document. The hearing was in 10 days. Sienna thought those 10 days were her victory lap. She didn't realize they were my exit window. I walked to my room and locked the door. I had one more call to make. The buyer for the house had cleared the wire transfer. The estate was no longer mine, but it wasn't Julian's or Sienna's either. It belonged to an investment firm in Dubai. The night before the hearing, I insisted on a final dinner in the formal dining room. I wore my best pearls and a black silk dress. Sienna was glowing, already acting like the mistress of the manor. She spent the meal talking about the renovation she planned to start on Monday. "We're going to tear out that old rose garden," she said, sipping wine I had paid for. "It's a waste of space. We need a modern infinity pool." Julian nodded absently. I watched him, wondering when my son had become so hollow. "The roses were your grandmother's favorite," I mentioned softly. Sienna laughed. "Well, Grandma isn't here, and neither is the old Gloria. It's time for the Vance name to mean something modern." I raised my glass. "To the Vance name," I said. "May it always get exactly what it deserves." They drank, toasted to their own greed, and went to bed early to prepare for the court date. I stayed at the table long after the candles burned out. I wasn't mourning the house. I was waiting for the clock to strike midnight. At 12:01 a.m., the sale of the Vance estate became final. The keys in the foyer were now property of a corporation. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. A sterile box of wood and fluorescent light. Sienna sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing a modest navy suit that screamed, "Concerned family member." Julian sat beside her, looking like a man who had forgotten how to breathe. Their attorney, a sharp-faced man named Sterling, began his opening statement by painting me as a woman lost in the fog of her own mind. "We have documented evidence, Your Honor," Sterling said, gesturing toward a thick stack of papers. "Missing keys, dangerous incidents with kitchen appliances, and a total lack of awareness regarding her own estate's security. Gloria Vance is a danger to her own legacy." I sat at the defense table alone. I had no attorney. The judge, a woman with gray hair and eyes like flint, looked down at me. "Mrs. Vance, you've chosen to represent yourself. Do you have a response to these allegations of cognitive decline?" I stood up, smoothing my skirt. My hands didn't shake. "I do, Your Honor. But first, I'd like to clarify a matter of jurisdiction. The petition seeks to seize control of the Vance estate to protect it. However, you cannot seize what no longer exists." The judge's eyebrows shot up. Sienna leaned forward, her smirk faltering. "What do you mean it doesn't exist?" Sterling barked. I pulled a single, notarized document from my briefcase and handed it to the bailiff. As of midnight, the Vance estate was sold in its entirety to an international investment group. The house, the land, and the commercial holdings have been liquidated. The proceeds have already been moved into a private, irrevocable trust that is outside the reach of this court's current petition. Sienna stood up, her face turning a blotchy red. That's impossible. She's lying. She's too confused to sell a house. On the contrary, I said, looking directly at Dr. Aris, who was sitting in the witness gallery. I used the very Dr. Sienna hired to verify my competence for the sale. I had a private evaluation done by a board of 3 independent neurologists 2 days after our clinic visit. Here are their reports. I am perfectly sane. I am simply a woman who realized her family was a nest of vipers. The judge looked at the reports, then at the sale deed. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the sound of Sienna's rapid, shallow breathing. The petition for conservatorship, the judge announced, her voice echoing, is dismissed. There are no assets to protect, and the medical evidence provided by the defense clearly outweighs the anecdotal evidence provided by the plaintiffs. The gavel hit the wood like a gunshot. Sienna turned on Julian, her voice a shrill whip. You said she was senile. You said we just had to wait. Julian didn't answer. He looked at me, and for the first time in a year I saw the boy I had raised. He looked terrified. Mom, where are we supposed to go? The moving trucks are at the house. They said they have orders to clear the place by 5. I gathered my things. I don't know where you are going, Julian, but the family home is now the property of a firm that plans to turn it into a luxury boutique hotel. They were very clear about the eviction timeline. I suggest you and Sienna find a motel. I walked past them without stopping. Sienna tried to grab my arm, but I sidestepped her with a grace she hadn't expected from an old woman. I had won the battle, but the war for my future was just beginning. I returned to the house one last time. The moving crew was efficient, stripping the walls of the portraits and the floors of the rugs I had walked on for 30 years. It should have been painful, but I felt a strange buoyant lightness. Every chair they carried out was one less thing tying me to a son who had betrayed me. Sienna and Julian arrived 20 minutes later. Their car screeched into the gravel driveway. Sienna ran into the foyer, looking at the bare walls in horror. My wallpaper. I already paid the deposit for the contractors. You should have checked the deed, Sienna, I said, leaning against the banister. In this state, a house can't be part of a conservatorship if it's sold before the papers are filed. You spent so much time gaslighting me that you forgot to watch the market. Julian walked up to me, his eyes red. Mom, please. We have nowhere to go. Sienna's parents won't take us and my accounts they're empty. I spent everything on the lawyers for the petition. I looked at him. You spent my future to try and steal my present. You made your choice, Julian. Now you get to live with it. Sienna came charging toward me, her eyes wild. You think you're so smart? You're just a lonely old lady. You'll die in some hotel room with your money, and no one will care. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small black device. I pressed play. Sienna's own voice filled the empty foyer. The recording from the night she confessed her plan while thinking I was asleep. Asterisk. Once she's in the home, we sell the silver first. Julian is too weak to stop me, and the old bat won't even know her own name by Christmas. Asterisk. Sienna froze. Julian turned to her, his face pale. You said you loved her. You said this was to help her. She said whatever she needed to, Julian, I interrupted. And you believed her because it was easier than being a good son. I've sent a copy of this recording to your employer and the local police for attempted elder fraud. I doubt they'll do much, but your reputation in this town is officially over. I handed the keys to the foreman of the moving crew. I didn't look back as I walked to the waiting car. I had a flight to catch, and for the first time in my life, I had no one's permission to ask. The airport was a blur of motion and light. I sat in the first-class lounge watching the rain streak across the windows. My phone buzzed incessantly, Julian calling, Sienna texting apologies, then threats, then more apologies. I blocked both numbers with a single satisfying tap. I looked at my passport. Gloria Vance. Age 59. Destination, Florence, Italy. I had bought a small villa overlooking the vineyards of Tuscany. It was a fraction of the size of the estate, but it was mine, truly mine, with no heirs lurking in the hallways and no daughters-in-law counting my pearls. I felt a pang of sadness for the Julian I used to know, but that Julian had died the moment he signed that petition. Flight 402 to Florence is now boarding, the intercom chimed. I stood up, carrying nothing but a small leather bag and the freedom I had bought with my own ruthlessness. I wasn't an unfit woman being ushered into the shadows. I was a queen who had burned her bridge just to watch the fire. The air in Florence smelled of rosemary and ancient stone. My new home was a sun-drenched villa with thick walls and a view that stretched for miles. On my first morning, I sat on the terrace with a cup of strong espresso. There were no moving objects, no accidental fires, and no whispers in the dark. I opened a local newspaper, though my Italian was still shaky. I didn't need to read the news to know what was happening back home. I knew Sienna and Julian were likely in a cramped apartment, blaming each other for the life they had thrown away. I picked up a pen and began to write a letter. Not to them, but to the board of a local orphanage I had decided to fund. My estate was being put to work, helping children who actually understood the value of a home. I looked out at the horizon, the gold and green of the hills rolling away under a perfect blue sky. I had lost a house, a son, and a legacy. But as the sun warmed my face, I realized I had gained the one thing Sienna could never seize: my own life. Back in the city I had left behind, the silence in the small two-bedroom apartment was deafening. Julian sat on a crate, they hadn't even unpacked, staring at a legal notice. Without the Vance estate as collateral, his business loans had been called in. The empire he thought he was inheriting had turned into a mountain of debt. Sienna paced the tiny kitchen, her designer heels clicking sharply on the cheap linoleum. "Call her again, Julian. She's your mother. She can't just leave us like this. It's illegal." "It's not illegal, Sienna," Julian said, his voice hollow. "She sold her own property. She moved her own money. We're the ones who tried to go to court, remember? We're the ones who officially labeled her incapable of supporting us." Sienna stopped and looked at him, her eyes cold and calculating. The mask of the loving wife was gone. Without the mansion, the cars, and the prestige, Julian was just a man with a failing business and a tarnished name. She realized then that she hadn't married a prince. She had married a shadow, and the sun had finally moved. Word travels fast in a town built on old money and reputation. By the following month, the recording I had leaked to a few choice acquaintances had finished its rounds. Sienna tried to show up at the annual charity gala, the one she had planned to chair once I was disposed of. She was stopped at the door. The hostess, a woman I had known since grade school, didn't even look her in the eye. "I'm sorry, dear, but this is a private event for families of integrity. I believe your invitation was misplaced." Much like Gloria's keys, Sienna stood on the sidewalk, the hum of the paparazzi she had once courted now feeling like a swarm of hornets. They weren't there to admire her dress. They were there to capture the fall of the woman who tried to steal from a senile widow. When she got back to the apartment, she found Julian drinking alone in the dark. He didn't ask how the gala went. He knew. They were pariahs locked in a prison of their own making, with nothing to talk about except whose fault it was. The fighting started in earnest when the bank seized the car. It was a luxury SUV Sienna insisted on keeping, even as their checking account dwindled to 3 digits. When the tow truck pulled away, Sienna screamed at Julian until her voice broke. "I didn't sign up for this," she shrieked, throwing a decorative vase, one of the few things they had managed to take from my house, at the wall. "I was supposed to be the Mrs. Vance. I was supposed to have the estate." Julian looked at the shattered ceramic. "You never cared about me, did you? It was always the house. It was always the trust fund." "Of course it was," she snapped, the truth finally erupting. "Who would marry a man as weak as you for anything else? You let your mother outsmart us. You're a failure, Julian." That night, Julian slept on the floor. The next morning, he didn't go to his office. He went to a lawyer's office, one of the few who would still take his call, and asked for the paperwork to end the marriage. But even that cost money he didn't have. In Florence, I lived a life of quiet luxury, but I wasn't naive. I hired a man named Roberto to keep an eye on the situation back home. I didn't want to talk to them, but I needed to know when the snake was cornered. Snakes are most dangerous when they have nothing left to lose. Roberto's reports arrived weekly. They were grim. Julian had moved into a studio apartment above a garage. Sienna had moved back in with her parents, but her father, a man who valued his own reputation above all else, had forced her to take a job as a receptionist at a local gym to repay her debt to the family name. I read the reports over breakfast on my terrace. I felt a flicker of pity for Julian, but then I remembered the courtroom. I remembered the way he sat silently while Sterling called me demented. Pity is a luxury for people who haven't been betrayed by their own blood. I closed the file and watched the olive harvesters in the distance. Justice, I decided, tasted better than any vintage wine. 6 months into my new life, a message appeared in my inbox that bypassed my filters. It was from a new burner account. * Mom, please. I'm working 2 jobs. I sold everything. Sienna is suing me for alimony she knows I don't have. I'm facing bankruptcy. I don't want the estate. I don't want the money. I just want to know you're okay. I made a mistake. I let her get in my head. Please just call me J**. I sat with the laptop for a long time. The J at the end reminded me of the notes he used to leave on the fridge when he was 10. For a second, the walls of my villa felt thin. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to be the mother who forgives everything. But then I looked at the legal files from the conservatorship case. I looked at the forged signatures Sienna had used, which Julian had overlooked. He hadn't made a mistake. He had made a calculation. He thought I was the weaker bet. I deleted the email without replying. If he was truly sorry, he would learn to survive without my shadow to hide in. I should have known Julian wouldn't stop at an email. He used the last of his savings, money he probably should have used for his bankruptcy lawyer, to buy a one-way ticket to Florence. I was at a small cafe near the Duomo enjoying a pastry when I saw him. He looked 10 years older. His suit was wrinkled and he had lost weight. He stood at the edge of the piazza, scanning the crowds until his eyes locked onto mine. He didn't run. He walked slowly like a man approaching a firing squad. He sat down at my table without waiting for an invitation. The waiter moved toward us, sensing the tension, but I held up a hand to stop him. You look tired, Julian, I said in Italian, then switched to English. And you're a long way from home. I had to see you, he whispered. I had to see if you were actually real, or if I just dreamed that you disappeared. I didn't disappear, I replied, setting down my spoon. I just moved out of the way so you could finally see the woman you married. Julian leaned over the table, his eyes wet. She's gone, Mom. The divorce is final. She took the last of the business accounts and moved to Vegas with some guy she met at the gym. I have nothing. I'm losing the studio. I just need a place to start over. I'll work for you. I'll garden, I'll handle the accounts, anything. I looked at his hands. They were soft. He had never worked a day of manual labor in his life because I had provided everything. That was my mistake. I had grown a vine that didn't know how to hold itself up. You want to start over? I asked. Yes, he gasped. Please. Then do it, I said firmly. But not here. There is no Vance estate here, Julian. There is only Gloria. And Gloria doesn't have an assistant. She doesn't have a son who tries to lock her in a cage. If you want to be a man I can respect, go back and earn your own ticket. Don't come to me for a rescue when you were the one who sank the ship. The look on his face was one of pure shock. He truly thought that seeing me in person would trigger the mother instinct, and I would fold. He didn't understand that the woman he was looking at was someone he had never actually met, the woman who built the empire, not the one who merely maintained it. You're really going to let me go back there with nothing? He asked, his voice trembling. I reached into my bag and pulled out an envelope. His eyes lit up with a spark of the old greed. He thought it was a check. He thought it was his salvation. I pushed it across the table. He opened it with shaking fingers. Inside was not a check, but a printed copy of the Unfit petition he had signed, along with a business card for a reputable labor placement agency in his home city. That's your inheritance, Julian, I said. The reminder of what you did, and the address of a place that will help you find a job. If you ever earn enough to buy a round-trip ticket to visit me as a son, and not as a beggar, my door might be open. But today the bill for this coffee is the last thing I will ever pay for you. I watched him walk away across the cobblestones. He didn't look back. He looked small against the backdrop of the cathedral. A tiny figure in a city that didn't know his name or care about his legacy. I felt a tear prick my eye, but I didn't let it fall. I was mourning the son I thought I had, but I was celebrating the woman I had become. I finished my espresso and paid the bill. The sun was setting over the Arno River, casting everything in a warm golden glow. I walked back to my villa, my footsteps steady. 4 years I had carried the weight of everyone's expectations, everyone's greed, and everyone's needs. Now the only weight I carried was the key to my own front door. It was a small key, but it felt heavier and more valuable than the entire Vance estate. A year later, the villa was flourishing. I had integrated into the community, my Italian was fluent enough to haggle at the market, and my name was respected for the right reasons. I was no longer the widow Vance, I was Signora Gloria, the woman who restored the old vineyard. I received a letter in the mail. It wasn't an email or a desperate text. It was a physical letter with a local postmark from back home. It was from Julian. Dear Mom, it began. I'm working in construction now. It's hard and I'm tired every day. I'm living in a rooming house. It's not much, but I paid for it with my own hands. I saw Sienna at the grocery store last week. She looked miserable. I didn't even say hello. I just wanted you to know that I'm still here. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to say, I finally understand why you sold the house. I put the letter on my mantelpiece. I didn't write back yet. He wasn't ready and neither was I. But for the first time the paper didn't feel like a weapon. I sat on my terrace for the final time in this story, watching the moon rise over the Tuscan hills. My life was divided into 2 halves. The one where I built a house of glass, and the one where I lived in a house of stone. The glass house had been beautiful, but it was fragile. It took a betrayal to show me that I was living in a cage of my own making. Sienna hadn't just tried to steal my money. She had inadvertently given me my freedom. By trying to prove I was unfit to live my own life, she had forced me to prove that I was the only one fit to command it. I took a deep breath of the cool evening air. The lights of the valley twinkled below like fallen stars. I wasn't an old woman waiting for the end. I was a woman at the beginning of a journey that was finally truly mine. I stood up, went inside, and locked the door. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew exactly who held the key.